Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 750,000 times in over 150 countries and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Poolua country in Tasmania. This is episode 242 of the Australian Hiker Podcast, and in this week's episode we talk about the South Coast Track, expectations versus reality. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published, and if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the supporters page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. In this podcast episode, we discuss our pre-trip expectations for the Tasmanian-based 85-kilometre South Coast Track and compare them to the reality of the trip itself. While I had certain expectations of the trip, some of which panned out as expected, there were things that ended up going very differently than expected. In this episode, we discuss how the trip panned out and make some recommendations that will help you get the best out of this experience if you ever look at doing this track. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, well, here we are looking at the planning and the reality of the South Coast Track. So the first thing we'll start with is the transport, the logistics, the accommodation, and what stuck out for you, Tim, in terms of what you were expecting and what didn't eventuate.
I must admit, I've sort of lost a bit of confidence in the Australian airline industry at the moment. There's just been too many cancellations of flights and quite often at short notice. So even though I potentially could have turned up on the day and then virtually get a transport over to Cambridge Airport to take me down to Melaleuca, that was a bit of a risk. So I ended up going down there the day prior and staying with relatives. Although, again, if you don't have relatives or you're not a Tasmanian local, there's plenty of good accommodation options in Hobart itself. The transport to Melaleuca, which is the main trailhead, is from Cambridge Airport, which is only a short drive from Hobart International Airport. So in that case there, it was a pretty easy sort of task to get to there. Arrived well and truly in time, and I must admit, I do say we a lot in this episode and the last few, only because I'm so used to travelling with other people, typically Jill.
And I wasn't there.
And you weren't there.
So I was wondering who the we were.
But I had a group of 9 that were travelling with me as their own group and another group of 2. So it's particularly for the first half of the trip, I was seeing people on quite a regular basis and was camping with people on a regular basis. Okay.
And did they overtake you along the way, or did they fall behind, or?
Yes and no. The group of 2 was definitely doing it at a much slower pace than what I was. The group of 9 was doing it at a slower pace only because they were taking a bit more time and taking it a bit more at a leisurely pace. But it consisted of a group of adult males approximately my age, a bit younger, and a group of 17 to 20-year-olds who would leave camp half an hour after I did and go screaming past me a few hours into the day.
That makes you feel young, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, it's certainly they certainly managed to power along quite well. Still with the transport side of things, the transport from Cambridge Airport by Par Avion, which is the little airline company that takes you down and transports bushwalkers. The trip itself was quite good, but there was issues on the day. So instead of getting in at roughly about 3:30, I think we landed in roughly at about 4:20, 4:30. There was a bit of delay. So it's one of those sort of expectations where You're in the hands of the weather gods to a great extent. And this was probably the biggest worry for me for this whole trip, that if the weather had been really bad or the wind's really strong and the planes couldn't fly, that potentially delayed the trip. And there was always the potential that if there was extreme weather conditions, it could have delayed the trip by a couple of days and potentially put the trip in jeopardy. So if you are planning this trip, always allow yourself a bit of leeway or a plan B just in case.
So we might start looking at the accommodation, and the first series of huts is at Melaleuca, which is where you fly into.
Yeah, so my original plan was to fly into Melaleuca, stay there overnight and start walking the next day. And having arrived, I was aware of what the daylight hours were in Hobart. It's pretty much Australia's southernmost major city. And they have, it's light at 5 o'clock, it's light at 9 o'clock at that time of the year in December.
So that's 8 a.m., 5 a.m. and 9 p.m.
Yeah,
that's a long day.
It's a long day. So I thought rather than arriving in at sort of 4 or 5 o'clock at Melaleuca and then just sitting there twiddling my thumbs, I'd start walking. But the potential is that if you don't feel like it, you can arrive at Melaleuca, which was my original plan, and either start walking, or there's 2 cabins there with toilets that are there for use for hikers.
So are they the only cabins on the trail, or are there other cabins or campsites along?
No, they're the only cabins on the trail. There are campsites, but they're the only physical buildings on the trail. So this trail is a wilderness trail. It's a wilderness experience. And while there are toilets, which we'll talk about a bit later on, really you're sleeping in a tent or sleeping in the open.
Okay, so why don't we talk about the facilities at the campsites then, so the toilets?
Okay, so when we're talking about facilities, we're talking about toilets, and these are basically just composting toilets. I must admit, the first campsite I came to, which was at Point Eric, I'm thinking, I'm sure there was supposed to be a toilet here somewhere, and they never really make them an obvious feature. One of them was probably around about 150 metres away from entering the camp, but in most cases they're a bit easier to find. Okay,
so you've got to go on a little bit of a hunt to
find them.
Find the facilities.
There usually are signs there, but you've got to know, once you get a grasp of where things are generally located, they're a bit easier to find. Now, in relation to the toilets, there is no toilet paper, so you need to bring your own toilet paper, whatever that amounts to for the length of the trip.
That's the 10 pieces per day that I fold up and send us off with. People are horrified that that's not quite enough, but when you've got to make it last, you make it last.
One comment I would make, and it's not really a facility as such, I decided one day that I needed to use the facilities and there was none, so I started digging a hole. It was actually quicker to walk to the next toilet facility. The soil is really hard, and obviously you can't really, the choice is to dig it in a beach, which is not particularly environmentally friendly. But if you're trying to dig into soil, it is rock hard.
Right.
More so than the Australian Alps that I'm used to. You're better off to time your ablutions to when there's a toilet facility available.
Right. And at the campsites, are there things like an outdoor kitchen or a table or anything like that?
In most cases, there's pretty much nothing. When they're talking about campsites, it's flat bits of soil that have been cleared. Occasionally, you'll get some jerry-rigged tables and chairs. So there was a couple that we went to, or that we went to as a campsite that had bits of mesh on rock to act as a table, and a bit of timber on rock and a couple of pieces of stone that you could sit on. Mm-hmm. And there was one campsite that had a couple of, I don't know who did them, a couple of very basic chairs, but there were one chair for the entire campsite. So
okay.
When you had sort of 12, 13, 14 people, there was one chair.
So what was the busiest campsite? How many people would have been at the busiest?
I think we had a few nights where there was a group of 2, a group of 9, so that's 11, and myself, which was 12.
Yeah.
And in most cases, that's the biggest number. And that was the first, second and third nights that's what we ended up with. And then the group sort of spread apart.
Right.
So I ended up having 3 nights camping by myself and the other 3 nights camping with other people.
Right, okay. And do you have to camp at these campsites, or are you able to camp at any point along the way?
There are what's classed as major campsites, and the major campsites have toilets. There are minor campsites and also emergency campsites that don't. There are just bits of flat ground. And in fact, a couple of the ones I stayed in, flat ground was a pretty subjective term. There was one that I stayed at, it was a slope, and there was no other way you could describe it.
Bit of rush of blood to your head, was there?
So there was one night where I didn't camp at a designated site. And in all honesty, I'm not sure. I'll need to check on that when I do the written write-up of this trail. But I decided I needed to stop. I was starting to lose focus, and that's not a safe way to hike. Really, if you get to that sort of point, it's time to stop. Otherwise, you end up putting yourself in a situation where you may need rescuing, which is not going to be helpful for anyone.
Yeah, and I think that was the night you were probably only a couple of kilometres from the campsite.
I was probably 2 kilometres from the campsite, which was Surprise Bay. It only took me less than an hour to get there the next morning. But had I have continued on that night, I would have had to have done the extra hour, which wouldn't have been an overly long day. I would have still finished in the light, and then I would have had to have done an inlet crossing. And again, having a bit of mental sharpness is probably something that you needed to have at that point.
Yeah, so it turned out to be the best thing to do under the circumstances.
It did. Now that did put me behind an hour or two for the trip from then on, but it was the safer option to go through and do.
You've mentioned along the way that this was a pretty tough trail, so let's talk about the trail tread and the diversity of what you were walking on.
I think when most people think about the South Coast Track, if you do a search of the South Coast Track on the internet and look at images, you tend to see images with lots of people sinking into mud. And that's the
or waist deep in water. That's the other one I see. Yeah.
They're the typical sort of images that tend to come up. So there was an expectation prior to the trip there'd be a lot of mud, and there was. But in some areas, they've started to do some remediation. They're putting in mesh boardwalks, which is the new material they're using for a lot of trails around Australia. And these, there was one area in particular where I was expecting to have a lot of boggy, wet area, and spent probably a period of about 2.5 kilometres walking on mesh, where had I been walking on open ground, it would have been very wet and very muddy. So that they're starting to make improvements to the trail bit by bit.
But you did find a pretty deep mud hole though.
Yeah, so there was the mesh, metal mesh. There was the older traditional timber, normally two boards side by side, not always above water, and then there were some muddy areas. And it's really hard when you try to not destroy the trail and not make braided trail by creating your own trail. And sometimes I did that.
So you walked through the middle of it, did you?
Yeah, I walked through the middle of it where I could. I must admit, I got a bit blasé at one point, and this was just past the turn-off to Osmeridian Beach, which was where the group of 9 split apart and decided to do their own thing. I kept on going, and about 300 metres down the trail, I thought, yep, I'll do the right thing. I'll walk through the muddy area. I didn't check the depth of the mud, which was my fault, and then sunk crotch depth up in the mud. It just sunk. It wasn't a slow sink. It was straight into it.
One leg, 2 legs?
Both legs.
Oh, my goodness. How'd you get out of that?
Well, I just sat there for a minute or two. I thought, oh, yeah, this is lovely. Thankfully, I had my rain pants on. And then I was by I could reach the sides of the trail, and then just drag myself out slowly. So It was an interesting thing, and that section in particular.
I'm sorry, that would have been so funny.
Well, all I could think of was there was no one to take a photo of me. At least if I'm going to do that, I should have a photo. It's one of the disadvantages of travelling solo. The trail tend to vary as well. So there were some of the hills going up. They were very much steps with crushed rock. Coming down, the trail varied to being natural, but natural to the point. So as an example, coming down the Ironbound mountain ranges, that's a high point as a walker was 910 metres. And going up, it was steep, but it was manageable. And going down, it was walking down pretty much a creek bed for 3.5 hours, 4 hours. It was very wet, very slippery, lots of tree blowdowns, so you're having to go under, over and around. And it was a very slow process.
Yeah. So you talked about lots of water. Is it this time of year? Is it unseasonal wet weather? Can you give us a bit of a sense of what to expect throughout the year, irrespective of when you go?
Tasmania is one of those sort of places, particularly in the high country areas, where you can get snow pretty much any month of the year. And the season, I suppose, for the South Coast Track is probably around about late November through to maybe mid-April, with sort of that February, March sort of period probably being potentially the driest, but also the hottest as well. So, the potential is to get 30-odd degree plus temperatures, which is going to make things a lot harder. But, there's the combination between, do you want rain, do you want water availability, do you want dry conditions? And that's going to generate a different experience for each time you do this. So I've talked to people who have done this trip in 4 days before, but they would have had good conditions to do it in.
So not lots of water and not crotch deep mud.
No. I think the other thing I'd comment on the trail itself is, and then we'll talk about things to bring along later on. So tracking poles are essential. You need to have those 4 points of contact, and there was no one I saw on trail that didn't have tracking poles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now we'll look at the distances. You had planned to do this in 5 days.
5 days walking. So I was going to fly into Melaleuca, not go anywhere the first day. 5 days walking, and then get transport back to Hobart.
Okay. And it took you 7 days?
7 days walking, and that includes the transport back to Hobart. So I added an additional day time-wise, but I also added 2 additional days of walking.
Right. Okay. And normally the recommendation is 6 to 8 days.
6 to 8 days, yeah. Now,
so it sounds right.
It sounds about right. I think, as I said, I arrived at Melaleuca, and I even before I'd gone to Melaleuca, I thought I'm not going to sit there for 4 or 5 hours and do nothing while it's light. So I just decided to walk 13.4 kilometres the first night. And that's probably the best thing to do. It's, unless you're really being cruisy about what you're doing, it's a much easier process to just do that walk. You've got plenty of time. The track in that first day from Melaleuca to Point Eric is probably the fastest of the whole trip, and probably the cleanest of the whole trip as well.
Right, okay. And then day 2, you'd planned to do 18.6, and that's what you did?
Yep, roughly about the same sort of distance, and that was from Point Eric through to Louisa River. Again, not overly difficult. A bit more mud on that day, but not horrendous. And that was getting ready to. That was a bit of an ascent up and over. I think no, don't quote me on this. I think it was the Red Hills, and that was an ascent of about 400 metres, but it wasn't an overly difficult, although it was a bit wet at times.
Right. Okay. And then day 3. You'd planned to do 18.4 and you did 12.3. So that sounds like a hard day.
Yeah, now that was up over the Ironbound Ranges, The recommendation for that is 6 to 9 hours. I think it took me 12 hours.
Wow.
And it wasn't so much the ascent up. That was hard. There's no argument about that. It was the descent down. And as I said, even regardless of whether you're traveling as a group or as a solo hiker, the last thing you want to do is sprain an ankle or break a leg. And if you push yourself by trying to go too fast, and I was walking down creek bed for most of that descent, it was a slow process, and there are advantages to being tall when you had to step down. There are advantages to being short when you needed to go underneath branches and trees.
Okay. And day 4, you'd planned to do 12.2 and you did 14.4.
Yep.
So that sounded like a relatively easy trail that you were on at that point in time, noting that you were probably at a different point to where you'd planned to be.
Yeah. Well, I think that wasn't an overly difficult day. Nothing was as hard as coming down the Ironbound Ranges. So there's definitely that. But the terrain certainly varied. But I was close on the distances that I planned, although I was starting to fall behind at this point.
Right. Okay. And then day 5, 11.4, and you did 10.9.
Yeah. Yeah. So pretty much where I expected to be there.
And then day 6, you hadn't planned to be walking day 6, but you did 9.56. And day 7, again, you hadn't planned to be walking day 7, and you did 6.98.
Yeah, and that was into Cockle Creek, into the trailhead.
And was that getting easier at that point in time?
From that last day was relatively easy. I'd actually come across hikers going the other way, and they said, "Oh yeah, the between the last major campsite and Cockle Creek, the trail is there's a few muddy patches, but relatively good condition. But there was mud pretty much every day." So.
Yeah, and you were saying that you were describing the hike to someone in terms of the lunges, the squats,
Yeah, and I think that's the thing for me. I mean, I'll be honest. This was physically the hardest thing that I've ever done. The Bibbulmun track, which is 1,000 kilometres, that's all about endurance and just putting one foot in front of the other. This is an 85-kilometre track. It was harder than the Bibbulmun track.
Yeah.
It was, and as I said, it was a matter of I had periods of days, particularly within the Ironbound Mountains, where I was just step up for 910 metres, a short section over the top at the summit and starting to come down where it was walking. And then from there on it was step down, squats, lunges again, step ups, climb around things. And I'd actually gotten to the stage whereby after a couple of days of that, not being able to walk properly because I was just doing this almost multiple days of exercises.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the physical impact, but what about the mental impact of this hike on you?
Mentally, it was fine. I mean, I must admit, I got to a stage I thought I've had it with the mud. I think I can do without that. It was a good trip in that respect. I have
to say, your gear was pretty whiffy when you came home.
Yeah, I think I made the mistake of with my pants. I had a rain jacket on. I didn't have any rain pants on going down the Ironbounds. So as a result, my pants were saturated. So, and again, it was wet enough overnight where they weren't going to dry out. So I swapped to rain pants for 3 days, and that was actually a good move.
Oh, you just wore your rain pants and no trousers underneath?
Yeah, it worked well.
Okay, well that's an interesting thing to do. You couldn't do that if it was really hot, I guess.
No, but yeah. So mentally, it was a matter of you had to be very much focused. I know from my perspective. On a trip like the Bibbulmun, I'm able to go into autopilot, walk, keep myself focused about what's going on. But in this trip here, it's mentally fairly taxing because you do have to be paying attention to what's going on. You can't tune out.
Yeah. And the thing that I noticed was that, you certainly couldn't phone me. I think you phoned once, and it was a pretty bad conversation. But I was relying on the satellite positioning to work out where you were, and we were doing satellite messaging a little bit. So that says there's not a lot of phone coverage on this trail.
I must admit I didn't have my phone on the entire trip, but there was 2 points, the top of the Iron Bounds, and when you get up to the Iron Bounds, you walk off trail about 40 metres up to a little rocky knoll, and that's where people were getting text messages only.
Okay.
People were very interested to hear what was going on with the Soccer World Cup.
Okay.
But yeah, text messages only, no phone calls. Yeah, it was 1 bar 3G, and that was it on Telstra. There was another location on the second last day where I actually managed to call you. That
wasn't a great. I'm not sure that I would call that a phone conversation, but yes.
No, and talking to the Tasmanian Wilderness Experience, which is the transport company, they said it's a bit like standing on one leg with your tongue poking out to get a signal. But it was a reliable text messaging, and as you. And on the very last day, coming into the last few kilometres, approaching Cockle Creek, there's reasonably good phone signal on Telstra as well.
Right, okay, all right. And so some of the other things around the environment, what you were seeing, I think it's a fire-free zone.
Yeah, so it's a World Heritage Area. It's a no naked fires. So if you're cooking, it's in a fuel stove. It's there are you can't just go and collect firewood and start a fire. It's illegal. Not that there are necessarily any rangers to come and see you, but if the rangers decide to drop in and if you've got a fire, it's an area that's fairly delicate. It can be damaged fairly easily, and in all honesty, it's a fairly wet environment, so it's not really suitable for fires anyway. So fuel stoves. And because you are typically flying into Melaleuca, you can't take gas. On the trip. So what they end up doing is they actually transport in, and I don't know how they do it. They transport in gas to the aerodrome there. There's a shed there, and you pay for that before you get on the plane, and they hand you a gas cylinder before you head off.
So you were worried that they were going to hand you a big gas cylinder. Did they do that?
Well, they did. They used the 2 30-gram gas cylinders, which worked out well, actually. I'm quite comfortable using a 100-gram gas cylinder on a 6-day trip. And given the amount of times that I used it for this trip, 100 grams would have lasted me. But if I I only have a cup of tea in the morning, and I didn't even do that all the mornings. So if you're having a fully cooked breakfast morning and then a cooked dinner, you probably do need the 2 30-gram cylinder.
Right, okay, all right. And so what did you see?
Vegetation-wise, it was quite interesting. It's this is a coastal track. It is called the South Coast Track, so you are walking along sections of beach. You are walking along rainforest and coastal vegetation. You are walking up and down over hills, and when you think of the really heavy forested and mossy and ferny sort of environments, there was periods where I was walking through tunnels like that, complete with mud.
You've got a couple of videos in the slideshow where it's just you're walking along a boardwalk and it's just beautiful. And very lush, and then there are other parts where it's so harsh and, very little vegetation, lots of rocks. Yeah.
So there's button grass plains, which is one of the main vegetation types along the way. And again, you just have this picture in your mind of this stuff being sort of 30 centimetres tall, but it's, in a lot of cases it's up to a metre. So it's very, very much, that's where a lot of the water is. It's a very water-loving plant. So it's not unusual to get a lot of mud in those areas, and as a result, they've put a lot of focused their boardwalks in that area as well. It was definitely, as I said, even though I was aware it was a coastal walk, it was probably more coastal walking than I expected. So there was, one section that was about 4 kilometres. There was sections that were might have only been a couple of 100 metres. Walking along the beach, you also sometimes, depending on the tides, ending up having to walk on large rocks. So, if the tides were a bit high, it pushed you up onto the rocks, which means that slowed you right down.
Right.
Animal life was a bit variable. After a couple of days, I was in my head writing an article saying there are no snakes in Tasmania.
Don't.
I have never seen a snake in Tasmania. I saw two on this trip. One was on the warm day, and I saw the back end of a very small black snake scuttling off the trail, off the timber boardwalk, where it was obviously sunbaking. The other one was a black snake that was about 35 centimetres in the middle of the trail, and I saw it and I thought, hang on a sec, why isn't it moving? And then realised it had a clear red fluid leaking from its head.
Ooh.
So and every so often it would poke its tongue out, but it wasn't moving. By the look of it, I think what had happened is someone had trodden on its head while it was in the middle of the trail and probably had not even noticed it.
Oh, my goodness.
It wasn't going to survive. So I got my tracking pole up. I lifted it. It was very limp and not moving, and just put it off the trail. But it wasn't going to live. Other wildlife, pademelons, which are one of the little short, stumpy kangaroo types of animals. And the thing that did surprise me with this trip is spotted quolls. At one of the campsites, I lost my spoon. I left my stove out at night time, which is what I normally do. I stupidly left my spoon, my cup, and my rubbish bag out. I got up in the morning. The stove had been knocked over. The spoon had gone. The rubbish bag had gone, but I retrieved that, and the cup was okay. And I thought it might have been a bush rat, and we discovered that at the next campsite, or a couple of campsites further on, someone saw a quoll. And I saw a quoll on the last night I spent on trail the morning after. So not used to seeing quolls in mainland Australia.
Spoon-stealing quolls.
Yeah, Australian wildlife seem to like the rubberised silicone on camping gear, and I don't know what it is. Whether it's the taste, whether there was food still left on there, I don't know. But the spoon went. And I've had this spoon for a number of years, so I now need to buy a new one. Was a reasonable amount of bird life, mainly the little birds rather than the big birds. So beach birds, some of the plovers and the different types of birds. There were a number of different seabirds, seagulls, and the little fairy wrens. So, but not a lot of other larger inland life, and the weather certainly wouldn't have helped with that.
So the other thing that was interesting about this hike were the inlet crossings.
So again, another coastal walk, so you need to expect inlet crossings, and there are a number of inlet crossings. Some of them barely passed as inlets; they were quite shallow, quite narrow, and quite shallow. Others are a bit different. So the comment I would make here before I talk specifically about inlets is I took 3 pairs of socks with me. I thought that's a bit rare for me, and I typically don't use socks at night time. So these were 3 pairs to rotate through. My dry socks were wet within 50 metres of leaving the runway at Melaleuca.
Well done.
And even I'd go through and rinse them out and clean my shoes and the socks and dry them out as best I could. And within half an hour of the next day, your socks and shoes were sopping wet again. So pretty much, with the exception of probably the first and the last day, expect to have wet feet. And if having dry socks is something you really want, you're probably going to need to have 2 pairs a day.
Lots of socks.
Lots of socks, yeah. So it's almost a losing battle.
Yeah, okay. So the inlet crossings then.
Okay, so the inlet crossings tended to vary. Quite often they were just a matter of walking through ankle-deep sort of water, and they weren't really an issue. Sometimes there was probably one of the best-known ones is the New River crossing, which is at Pryon, and that's where you cross the inlet in a boat. Mm-hmm. So there are currently 2 boats there. Apparently they're looking at putting a 3rd boat in, and there is supposed to be 1 boat on each side, although that doesn't always happen. And unfortunately what that means is if there's not a boat on your side, you've got 2 choices. You either turn around and head back to Melaleuca, or you wait until someone comes the other way and brings a boat across.
Oh.
So this is why they're trying to put a third boat in there. So that was a bit of a hard crossing in some respects. So the crossing was probably about 90 metres, and most of it was probably only 40 or 50 centimetres deep, with a deeper section in the middle. But you put a life jacket on, you put a couple of oars on, you need to drag the boat down to the water. So the ideal is to actually turn up to pry on at high tide, so you've got to minimise your boat drag. I'm a large, fairly strong guy, and it took me a while and a fair bit of effort to get this boat down. I just had to it was almost like a little jumping motion that had, get the pointy...
Bounce it down a bit.
Bounce it down the boat, yeah. So you get the pointy end pointing towards the water and then just bounce it progressively down. Once you get it in, it's okay. You then row across, and if you've never rowed a boat before, that's always a bit of a challenge.
I did wonder, it's probably been a while since you've rowed a boat, Tim.
It's been a while, but I have done rowing before, but it was just a matter of I realised there were different length oars, so I'm trying to work out
halfway across, you realise that.
I'm thinking, why is one? I don't know. I tend to be dominant in one arm, but why is one arm making so much a difference than the other? So yeah, make sure you get the same length oars. You get across to the other side. I dropped my pack and my tracking poles across. I then had to get the other boat and get it in the water and attach it to my boat. Attach some more oars in there because most of the oars are on the other side. Bring some extra life jackets over because most of them are on the other side. Go back over. Attach one boat back onto the clip again, which means dragging it out of the water.
Oh my goodness!
Putting the life jackets away, putting the poles back in their little slot, and then rowing back again. So you typically get 3 trips. This is where having a group would be helpful. To get the boats in the water, but it means not everyone would have to do 3 trips.
Yeah. You can rotate the rowing.
But certainly, as I said, apparently the plan is to put a third boat in there, which means there'll be 2 on one side, 1 on the other, which potentially may mean you might only have to do 1 trip depending on which direction you're coming from.
Right. Okay.
But that was an interesting one, and I found, as I said, most of it. I'm thinking, why am I hitting? What am I hitting? And again, I was hitting the bottom. So there was it was only really that section in the middle that was a bit deeper. I must admit, I think had there have been no boat there, I probably would have been inclined to see if I could get across with my pack. Not recommended, but given the choice of turning around and going back or waiting a day, it's a potential.
And you were talking about another. There's an iconic photo where people are holding on to a bit of rope and walking across. Yeah,
so there are inlet crossings, which are basically where the creeks or rivers are hitting the ocean, but there are also stream crossings further upstream. So there are a few of those, and there's ones that are really well known within the guidebooks, and you see this brownie coloured water because of the tannins off the plants. And there's a rope and people are walking, go down a little set of wooden stairs, walk across holding the rope for stability, and then walk up a set of wooden stairs on the other side. Now, if it was high water, the rope would, or the creeks were moving fast, the rope would be good. But one thing you don't realise is that to the right, if in the direction I was heading, which was from west to east, 1.5 meters away from the rope, the water's about 40 centimetres shallower. So if you're walking using the rope, it means you're walking in the deepest part of the creek. And given that there wasn't much movement, I and the other people that were crossing were just ignoring the rope and just walking into the shallows.
Right, okay.
Made things a lot easier.
Okay.
There are other inlet crossings as well, and there's a couple in the guidebook that are classed as dangerous at high tides. Now, I could see that being the case. So in the case of high tide, strong onshore winds, heavy rains pushing a lot of water down creek, yes, you would need to cross at low tide. In most cases, there wasn't as much water as there potentially could have been. The deepest inlet that I had was the last inlet coming into the last campsite, and I ended up being waist-depth water. And my plan was I'll walk across, I'll use the tracking poles to test the depth just to see where it is, and if I need to, I'll turn around and work out where I best need to cross. I got over halfway across and thought, well, it's just about here now, and kept on going. Except I then realised my phone and my camera were in my pocket, my rain jacket. So having to hold the tracking poles and hold my rain jacket a bit higher than I normally would do to keep the electronics out of the water.
Oh, that wasn't great. Yeah,
but yeah, it was that was much easier than I thought, and that was the tide was still coming in at that point, but it worked well.
And because it's tidal. Tide chart is an essential piece of equipment.
So whether you download, have an app on your phone that has the next 7 days with a tide chart for your trip, or whether you have you print one off from online before you come in, really the choice is yours to work out when you best need to get there. A couple of other crossings as well. There was one crossing that was only about 40 centimetres, 50 centimetres deep, only probably about 6 metres wide, but it was moving quite quickly with water coming out. And that one was, it required you to take slow steps and brace yourself for the tracking poles.
Right, okay, all right. So having said all of that, when's the best time to do this hike?
From what I can understand, the best time to do the hike's probably mid-January through to around about mid to late March. But again, from me, I just wanted to do it before Christmas. I had the time available. So I think that was when I would go through and look at that.
Okay, all right. And how did the guidebook go in terms of guidance?
The guidebook was good. In all honesty, I think the guidebook is essential. I think it's worthwhile having. It does something that I like really well in that it has an east to west and a west to east option. Most books don't do that. They have one direction.
One direction, and then you have to turn yourself inside out to work out the other direction.
Yeah, and it works pretty well there. And this is because a lot of people who are walking the South Coast Track and Port Davey Track combined will often leave from Cockle Creek and get picked up at the end of the Port Davey Track by road transport. So it's good in that respect. One comment I would make here, and at the trailhead at Cockle Creek, there's a sign by Parks Tasmania that says, if you are using the guidebook, be aware that the timings aren't as accurate as they could be, and some people take longer. And I think that's not unrealistic. I think you do need to allow 6 to 8 days to do this walk. And I would suggest, unless it's really dry conditions and had no rain for a long period, you're not going to do it in that 4 to 5 day period.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is to watch out for is that even if it is really dry, if it's really hot, then some of those climbs are going to be pretty tough and will slow you down as well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
What must you take on this hike?
Okay, definitely need rain gear, and I think that includes rain pants as well. As I said, I had 3 days. I probably should have been wearing rain pants coming down the Ironbounds. I was worried about shredding them more than anything else, but I had a new pair of rain pants which were much more durable, and they lasted really well. But it's as a result, I ended up getting sopping wet pants, which forced me into rain pants for the next 3 days, and it worked well.
Right.
So rain jacket, rain pants. Tracking poles are a must. There is just no way you can maintain footing without falling over. I think I probably fell over 4 times in total. Once I lost a fight with a very small stick and pushed it out of the way, and it pushed back, and it was a very small stick, I can tell you. It was enough pressure just to push me off balance, and I fell over into the shrubbery. I think a clothesline of some sort, and it doesn't have to be a formal clothesline, but even a piece of blind cord that you can hang up your gear to dry off at night time, if that's possible. Now, if you're going to do that, you need to have a tarp or something that you can dry your gear underneath. The one day I did manage to dry my gear, I was under a heavy, dense bush that had almost a solid cover over the top, and it was wind, and there was no rain that night.
Yeah,
so
okay.
that allowed me to dry my pants off at least, not my socks. I would suggest tide chart, definitely there as well. I would also suggest carrying some extra food. So if you plan on doing it in 6, make sure you've maybe got an extra day and a bit of food. I did. My food taste changed on this hike. I just lost all interest in cereal. So I ended up not eating my cereal for all but one day. And had I been desperate, I could have eaten cereal for a few days. I would have probably preferred one extra nighttime meal just for a hot meal at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Instead, I had dips and bread, which was filling, but I would have liked the hot meal.
Yeah, okay. And the other thing that was pretty rank when you came home were your gaiters.
Yeah, no, definitely. Gaiters are a must. There was full length gaiters, and there was a couple of reasons I wore gaiters. One was my concern about snakes in Tasmania. But I think there's probably two main reasons for wearing gaiters. One is the mud, and that's to keep mud off your clothing. That time that I actually sunk into the mud to crotch depth, had I have not had the gaiters, I think I would have lost my shoes and then spent the next few hours digging out a mud heap to try and retrieve.
Head down in the mud.
Trying to retrieve shoes. So the fact I had the gaiter straps underneath and they were attached to my legs meant that my shoes stayed put where they should be. The thing that really does surprise me with gaiters, I see a lot of hikers wear shorts and gaiters, and without fail, they're the ones that had leeches on them. So they'd end up with leeches getting in on over the top of their gaiters and then
down
and working their way down.
Wow. Okay.
So or else getting underneath and working their way up. Whereas I had long pants, I did get gaiters, I did get leeches. But it was mainly on my hand. I had one on my lip at one stage, and it was only because it was being greedy. It was rather than attaching itself, it was just worming its way across my lip. And I flicked it off, but it should have just decided that, hey, here's a real nice juicy spot. Why don't I just attach? And just kept on going.
It was lucky I wasn't there because when you flicked it, you would have flicked it onto me because that's usually the thing that happens.
And I did have my shoes end up getting a hole at the front, and that's because my right shoe is a size too big to cater for my left. And I was actually, with my toes, I was putting pressure up and put a hole in the material at the front. So I was trying to work out how I ended up with this big fat leech inside my shoe, inside my sock. Now, I know it got inside the hole in my shoe. I just don't know how it got inside my sock.
Okay.
It was very fat and happy when I got rid of it. It had fallen off at the end of it.
So who's this trip for?
Okay, this trip is for probably I'd class as two sorts of people. Experienced hikers who have done a lot of hiking that are good and can think on their feet. So basically experienced hikers. Or if you're not experienced, someone with an experienced group leader that can look after you and do a lot of the logistical side of things and can talk you through the process. I wouldn't recommend this trip to inexperienced hikers. If you haven't done the overland track, don't try and do this one. The overland track does not do this one justice, but if you struggle doing the overland track, this one will be very difficult. So it really is for experienced hikers.
And as you say, this is wilderness hiking. I mean, you've got makeshift campsites where there's one seat for several people. You've got to go in search of the toilet. To not always close to the campsite, and there's no kitchen shelter or anything like that. So, you're out in the elements, whatever that might mean for the particular time that you're there, and you need to be able to cope with that.
And I think the real thing is with this is that if you have a problem, I was solo hiking, but there are plenty of other people around. But if you're solo hiking and there's no one there and something goes wrong, what do you do? And that's having that experience and having the ability to think, okay, well, these are my choices, or I can wait, I can turn around, I can set off my emergency beacon, whatever the case may be. And having the ability to think that through only comes with experience. But yeah, for me, this was as I said, physically the hardest thing I've ever done. And I wouldn't have wanted to do this having virtually no overnight experience at all.
So trip highlight, what was the big highlight?
The trip highlight was ascending the Iron Bounds. I talked to another hiker who had come the other direction, and she said when she crossed it, it was white out and heavy rain, so she didn't get any views. We went up there, we probably had the warmest weather of the whole trip. It was probably getting 18, 19 degrees, I'm estimating. And the views down to the ocean and across the plains were just spectacular.
Right.
And every time you'd go up another bit, there'd be different views to different directions. So that was really the highlights.
Right. And probably should have done this the other way round, because I'm now going to ask you about the low light. So it's not good to finish on a low light, is it?
And that's descending the iron bounds on the other side. The weather.
It wasn't the mud hole that you fell in?
No, that was only a short-term thing. So, I mean, it was borderline, but it was just there was a number of hours where you were just having to be so focused on where you're putting your foot, where you're putting the tracking poles, and what you needed to focus on. It was a lot of hard work. I could have. It was interesting, but I could have done without that.
Yeah, yeah. So we've had a bit of a tour of your experience on the South Coast track, and I guess we've talked about what the experience is, that you need to have experience to do it, or be with experienced people, and more importantly, take the gear that you need. And I think the last thing I would say is expect the unexpected.
Definitely. And I think one thing with this trip is it's really going to depend. The experience you have is going to depend on the weather conditions, which will impact the trail. So I could go back and do this in 2 months' time in very dry conditions and have a totally different experience than what I had this time. And that's not guaranteed. It could be wetter in 2 months' time. It could be drier, but I would expect the conditions to be better. So it's not one of these sort of trips where you can say this is what it will be. It's one of these trips where it's potluck. You get what you get, and you make the best of it. Now, one final comment I would make through here, and it was a discussion with another hiker, was this trail is not about the distance. When you look at this trip and you say 85 Ks, I can do that in 3, 4, 5 days. It's really easy. I had periods for extended periods where I was only travelling at 1 kilometre an hour or less. So it's not the sort of thing where you can say I can push through this and knock it off in 3 or 4 days. You possibly could do in really good conditions, but it's all about what the conditions are and the impact on the track.
And I just keep the word that keeps coming back to me is wilderness. It's a wilderness trail.
Yeah.
It's for experienced people, and the other descriptor you give is it's potluck. So whatever happens on the day, whatever happens in that week around the weather and the conditions is what you get.
And there is discussion about whether they are going to increase boardwalks and put huts or shelters of some sort along there, and that will change the experience. So the group of 9 that were there, they wanted to do it before that happened. And certainly, in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, if they do put more boardwalks in, if they do put more facilities in, huts and shelters and things like that, it'll totally change the experience. So really, this is one of the last real wilderness experiences around. And if that's what you're after, definitely worth looking at.
Okay, that's great.
All right, we hope you've enjoyed this expectations versus realities view of the South Coast track. And if you're planning on doing it, that might be a bit of a help to you in an upcoming trip. But otherwise, thanks very much for listening in on this. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.